I'm Joan Apple-Lemoyne. I'm a member of the World Affairs Council of Hilton Head and a member of the Board of Directors. And it's my pleasure to introduce number 7 on our 8 forces reshaping the global economy with the Economics of Disinformation. As Bill said earlier today, big tech as a force of change is one of the issues we'll be dealing with. You're going to pick up Richard's book on the way out, and one of the things he says is that disinformation undermines democracy because democracy depends on the free flow of information. I'm sure that's going to come up in the discussion that we have from the panel. I'd like to introduce our moderator. To my immediate left is Karen Kornbluh, Richard Stengel in the center, and Amanda Bennett. Their bios are in your program, and I'm not going to take your time in telling you their extensive qualifications for this panel. Thank you.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this panel because there's so much talk these days about disinformation, and it's, every day there's current events talking about how disinformation is spreading, but Rick and Amanda are really on the front lines, have been on the front lines of this. As Amanda is an independent journalist for her career, but now at Voice of America, where she's very much in the front lines of defending independent journalism, and she'll talk more about that. And Rick, who was Undersecretary at the State Department for Public Diplomacy, during so much of the run-up to the 2016 election and was engaged in that whole information warfare, which he's written about in his book. So I think this is exactly the right panel. I'm just so eager to hear what they both say. I think you couldn't find better experts on this topic. I want to start with Rick maybe, since we've pulled him away from MSNBC to be on this panel. But also because your book is so current, and then I want to move to Amanda because I think what's underdeveloped in this whole conversation is the role of the press and what independent journalism actually means, that it's not just another source of information, another speaker. But so starting with Rick, talk about whatever you want to talk about, but what I'd really like to hear about is you start out and you talk about, or one of the things we all started thinking about when we started learning about disinformation was these Macedonian teenagers sitting on their bed, doing clickbait stories to make money. And I want you to talk a little bit about sort of the economics of disinformation, whether it's those Macedonian teenagers or the platforms. And how can we think about sort of the political motivation of disinformation versus the economic motivation?
Yes, Karen, thank you, and hello everybody. I'm really delighted to be here with you today to talk about such a dark subject. In my book, Information Wars, as Karen mentioned, I was Undersecretary of State at the State Department, and I came to that job after 7 years as editor of Time magazine. So I spent most of my career as a journalist, and 2 things happened very quickly. The first, ISIS beheading, Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea, the southernmost part of Ukraine. And I saw this tsunami of disinformation, propaganda, misinformation all around it. And even though I'd been in media my whole life, it was new to me, especially the Russian stuff. I hadn't realized the extent of what they did, all their secret things and public things, and it was a big surprise to me. And what they did and what they based their systems on is the fact that these big platform companies reward virality, right? Virality is when something, whether it's true or false, picks up a tremendous amount of steam and gets thousands of tweets, millions of likes, and their whole systems are based on things going viral. Remember, their whole systems are also based on not professional content like Amanda produces or I used to produce, but content from you and me, from everybody. That is their system. And by the way, you don't pay for it. You don't pay for Google search, the greatest search engine in human history. You don't pay for Facebook, which is the biggest publisher in human history. You don't pay for Twitter. Well, the reason that you do pay for it is they sell your information and they sell you ads. And those ads go to you whether you're on a site that has disinformation on it, conspiracy theories, or the New York Times, because you've expressed some interest in something before. So I'm not going to give a whole long thesis about this, and I'm not an anti-internet person, but it does. The whole internet works on virality, and virality doesn't depend on truth or falsehood. And often, falsehood is the thing that becomes more viral than the truth. And so we can talk about numbers and how that works, but that's the lay of the land and why disinformation is incredibly profitable. And remember, Google and Facebook get 70% of the digital ad network. That's like $100 billion. It's a crazy amount of money. Last year, for the first time, digital advertising passed the king of advertising for decades, which is TV advertising. Print advertising, you can't even see it compared to those, but that's the scale of the problem.
And just to follow up on that, so you started out, you were fighting ISIS when you were at the State Department. What did you learn about how one can and can't push back on disinformation?
So the book kind of pivots back and forth between countering ISIS and countering Russia, and they're a little different. And just to define disinformation for a second, disinformation is false information, untrue information that is delivered for a strategic purpose. In the case of ISIS, remember those early videos, and they were on Twitter. They were asymmetric warfare. It's for somebody who doesn't have a lot of money or tanks to be able to attack, and they put these violent videos to scare people. It had a disproportionate effect. ISIS was never an existential threat to the U.S., which Barack Obama said, and people criticized him for it. But after several months of these videos, 70% of Americans thought ISIS was a threat. That's a very successful disinformation campaign. But they never pretended to be anybody else who they were, where they were digital jihadis. They had nom de plumes, but they didn't pretend to be, like the Russians did, Republican women voters in Tennessee, or black activists in Alabama, or construction workers in California. So we could see ISIS's disinformation, and we were a little more successful in fighting it, including the platform companies who did a good job. The Russian stuff was invisible to lots of people. And it was only visible because it was a whole of government effort, because it connected, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg connected up with the foreign ministry in Moscow, and Russia Today, and Sputnik, and TASS, and all of that. So we could see that, and we were much less successful in fighting that.
So Amanda, your most recent award, I think, on top of all your Pulitzers and so on, you gave this amazing speech, and one of the things you talked about was that sometimes you feel like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, because you get to see the counterexample. What would life be like without an independent media, without independent journalism? And I just loved that analogy. And I wonder if you would talk to us about the importance of independent journalism and a free press from both sides of that window.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Yes, and Rick and I, it's really interesting because we have two sides of the same coin. And I think about him as talking about sort of like the moonshot or ultimate technology, and I'm reminding people, you light fires by striking matches. I'm like back in the a little bit in the Stone Age, and I think one of the important distinctions is exactly what you're talking about. We are experiencing this issue right now of disinformation and excess of information and bad information and things. We're experiencing it in a very rich and crowded and sophisticated ecosystem that includes a lot of free press from all different places. Maybe some, say there's too many things, it confuses us. There's so much of it. But I want to remind people that the biggest problem today, right now, has not to do with this, and Rick and I can argue about like whether it's biggest or not, but it is a big problem right now, is the really very blunt and unsophisticated but very, very effective stifling of just the regular actions of the free press. That is the thing that we are facing. And so when you go out into these other countries, you look at their ecosystem, part of the reason Voice of America, which is an independent, truthful news organization that tells both sides of every story, the reason we stand out is because it's in the middle of essentially, government-sponsored advertising for, whoever the dictator happens to be, my program. And so protecting the ability of either us or the indigenous journalists in that ecosystem, their ability to do something, to me, is our immediate problem. The information space, the technology is permitting these dictatorships to take extraordinary measures to silence their journalists. And so this is the future, and it's a real bad problem in the future. Our present right now has to do with something I don't think we've seen since World War II, basically, the shutting down of the free space around the world. So.
And how do you, for those of us who haven't grown up in journalism, but just appreciating and reading journalism, how do you distinguish between all these other speakers online and an independent press? How do you answer people's question when they say, well, VOA is just propaganda? How do you say, no, it's something else, and how do you describe that else?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, have you ever seen Voice of America? You know, just probably the first thing is like, look at it and see, because my contention, and I will be happy to be pushed back on by anybody in this room, is that by and large, not at the margin, the very sophisticated margin, but by and large, if someone looks at a truthful account of a situation and a manipulated or controlled account of a situation, they generally can tell whether they're seeing the truth or not. Maybe not right at the moment, but circumstances will tell them. And the example I'll give you, the oldest example of this that I know of is there was this big super train collision in China, and hundreds of people were killed, and the Chinese government put out nothing to see here, nothing happened, nobody was hurt, and people on the ground were uploading their pictures. And they were saying, oh, damn, no. And so the collision of those two views makes you see what's going on. So the same thing is happening right now in Hong Kong. We send out a picture of an intersection with 1,500 people. The Chinese media sends out the picture of the same intersection with 15 people. And pretty soon, not everybody, but enough people who matter, see those two things and say, I wonder what's going on here. So my sense is that if you have a truthful, well thought out and organized journalistic operation, many people, maybe not all people, but it has value because people can tell. And can I do my little test?
Yes.
Okay. This is a great audience, because I bet a lot of people here. How many people here read the Washington Post on paper? Nobody's admitting. That's too bad. Okay, never mind. What's important is inside the Washington Post in paper, once a month, there is the China Daily Supplement.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so somebody's heard about this, right? Inside the paper, the China Daily pays for a supplement that's their newspaper. And I ask, generally I get a room where a lot more people have actually read the paper. I say, like, how many of you read the Washington Post? Okay, yeah, everybody. Okay, good. How many of you have ever read that China Daily Supplement? Yeah, maybe once, right? Or for economic reasons. You don't read it to get news about China. Why is that? Because you take one look at it and you immediately recognize that it's a catalog, it's an advertisement, it's not news, you're not going to be getting anything real from it. Just as you are smart enough to tell that, don't underestimate the rest of the world. They are too. So that's my...
We did this at another panel,
yeah.
And Amanda asked the same question, and I got in the back and forth with the gentleman who asked the question about it, and I realized that he thought because something was written on paper, it was more factual than something that he read on his phone.
Yeah. That was interesting.
Okay, you're supposed to laugh at that.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick up on can I just pick up on what Amanda was saying about the importance of a free press? Stipulate, the importance of a free press is, as we said in the introduction, it's absolutely vital to a democracy. But what is under threat much more even than anytime since World War II, is this combination of strong men repressing free speech and a free press in these countries, but also using social media to get their point of view out there. Yeah. That's new.
Yeah, we're on the opposite sides of that problem.
Yes.
Right.
So so one of the things about Putin, not to talk about this guy all the time, but Putin was a CIA, was a KGB agent. Oh, I told the secret. Was a KGB officer in Dresden when the wall fell. not a very successful KGB officer. And what did he see? He saw that the wall fell not because of hard power, but soft power. American media, movies, all of this stuff. So what did he do when he became president? The first thing he did was take over the television networks. And one of the things that we saw, and we all saw, to my amazement, after the annexation of Crimea and I started traveling to the Baltics and the periphery, it's like, wow, there are lots and lots of Russian television stations throughout the Russian periphery, in Russian, giving news in Russian, and you know what? They're entertaining. They have game shows, they have reality shows. They made good TV, and they started doing that after the wall fell because Putin and others realized that's the secret, it's soft power. That's another part of the challenge. So even in Russia, he doesn't really repress free speech. Most Russians get their news from state media, and then all in the Russian periphery, they get their news from these kind of pernicious Russian stations because they're entertaining. They watch a game show, and then the news comes on. They watch a sports event, and then the news comes on. Because all of these countries have 30 to 40% of Russian speakers in it.
Yeah, and actually that's one of our critical advantages in Iran is, and our service chief in Iran, who is herself from Iran, says, you have just no idea how stultifyingly boring the state-sponsored media is, so we're doing cooking shows, just for that very reason. And shows about fast cars, which are unexpectedly popular in Tehran, but the same reason. The state-sponsored information is extremely boring and tedious, and so if they figure out how to do this better, they get better audience.
So I want to ask about fact-checking, because that's sort of the first line of defense online, is there's disinformation, and so fact-checkers are going to tell you if it's true or not. And Amanda, I know that at Voice of America, you've been experimenting with fact-checking, and Rick, I assume that you saw the pros and cons of fact-checking, and I wonder, Amanda, what has that been like? How do you get people to pay attention to fact-checking? There's a study out this week by an international NGO that found that some key pieces of fact-checked false information had been shared millions of times across the internet, which is pretty depressing, but...
That despite the fact it had been fact-checked,
Despite the fact it had been fact-checked, but then again, we don't know if people shared it, but took in the fact that it had been fact-checked and didn't believe it as much.
Yeah, a couple of years back, we started a fact-checking operation. We started with Russia because we just thought it was a good place to start, and we've just this week moved it over and going to start cloning it. So we think a fact-checking operation is good, that it's useful, and you should have that. And it produces some interesting news items from doing that. It's in English. It's a counterpart operation is done out of Europe in Russian. We call it Polygraph. We think it's a useful, good thing to do, and we will expand it to other languages. I don't think it's the answer. I think that filling the space with true information is a much more complicated, hard, and requires many more resources. But fact-checking things doesn't necessarily convince people that they're not right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I love quoting the great Pat Moynihan quote from many years ago where he said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, you're not entitled to your own facts." Ha, ha, ha. Well, he was very wrong. People obviously feel entitled to their own facts now, and they will disagree about things that are empirically different. And I actually think in the age of social media, in part because of things like deep fakes, in part because like the Russians imitate American news entities, it's very hard to verify a fact, and I'm not a truth absolutist in the sense that, other than 2 + 2, you can almost debate anything. So the bad guys use this bias against us. So one of the things I've been critical of, and I'm critical of in the book, is the media bias towards fairness. And fairness means two sides to an issue. So it's like if I'm up here and I say the moon is made out of green cheese, CNN will have some scientist on to say that it's not. And by the way, they might do it the other way around too. That's not fairness. There aren't two sides to a falsehood, right? So one of the things that the president does depend on is saying things that are empirically false. They get reported because he's the president of the United States, and then maybe disabused. But one of the things I also write about are all these cognitive biases that we have. One of them is there's a great book about belief echoes, and this is this idea that even when even when a false statement is rebutted immediately, it embeds itself in your brain, and it's never obliterated. And so, again, I'm glad I'm not a journalist anymore, because I don't want to repeat a falsehood in order to debunk it, because then it will get lodged in the person's mind. That's a hard issue for journalists and for anybody.
And one of the things that's been in the news a lot this week has been advertising, because Mark Zuckerberg said that he would allow politicians to avoid their fact-checking and advertise falsehoods. So they have for everybody else, they have a prohibition on advertising falsehoods, but not for politicians. And then Jack Dorsey of Twitter said, you know what, we're just not going to have any political advertising, and a lot of people criticize that. I'm wondering, and then where that debate went was, well, maybe you guys shouldn't be micro-targeting advertisements. So one of the things that you can do on the internet that you can't do on broadcast is you can pick your audience. And the algorithms also tailor the news feed and tailor your recommendations on YouTube. And I wonder how you think that plays into this world, this whole idea that you get personalized news online now in a way that you didn't get in the broadcast world, both in terms of spreading disinformation, but Amanda, also in terms of the old world of broadcast versus new. If you're trying to get your truth out, how do you find your audience?
So I'm going to make a distinction between regular advertising and political advertising. Political advertising is in a slightly different category because it's political speech, and we can debate that. But there's a bigger problem with just advertising in general, and I talk a little bit about this in my book. All digital advertising is automated. You know what that means? There's not that thing when we first started in journalism, there's not a phone call between two people saying, I want to buy an ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which Amanda used to edit, or I want to buy an ad in Time Magazine, or the 3 martini lunches that they used to do. It's two computers talking to each other. And people don't buy brands anymore. They don't buy the Philadelphia Inquirer or Time Magazine. They buy audience. So let's say I'm selling sneakers. I'm Nike. And young men between 18 and 24 buy sneakers. But you know what else they do? They look at a lot of nasty stuff on the web. But because you're typing in, I want young men between 18 and 24 who are interested in basketball, your ad goes to wherever they're looking, right? That's an automated ad. And that's why ads end up against, pornography and conspiracy sites and this and that. When advertising became automated and was dislodged from brands, which protected the truth and fact-checked, that also created the rise of disinformation. The reason the Macedonian teenagers made money is because of automated advertising, because they created, Donald Trump is the Pope, or the Pope, endorsed him, and that got a lot of eyeballs, and because they get on Google, you get paid per click, they were making money because more people clicked on that. It's not pay per truth, it's pay per virality. And that system, for better or for worse, which is very successful, does help the rise in disinformation.
You were talking a little earlier about the issue about choosing whether or not to accept political advertising. The thing I keep struggling with is, okay, well, who do you want to make all these decisions? We who are just putting out regular old truthful content in television, radio, digital, whatever, we depend a lot on these social media networks to get our information out. Well, because of these issues, all the social media providers are all struggling to decide which bucket they put all of us in. Are we good guys or are we bad guys? And looking at their understanding of a lot of this and the way they choose, excuse me one second, I'm going to cough and I don't want to blow you guys up. Where is it? Sorry. I don't necessarily like the idea of the people who are trying to make this decision about me, making blanket lots of other decisions that, what is truthful. They're having a hard enough time deciding what's a political ad. And so the question is, do you really want to create a czar, a private industry czar who makes his or her money from this, and say to them, you decide whether this is going to go on or not? I think that's a big question. You know, the machines are one thing, humans are another thing too. They're not necessarily, you know.
So that, you know, political speech, political advertising is more protected, right? I mean, our whole system is based on us making decisions about candidates, and we make decisions about candidates in part because of ads. That's why Mark said we're not going to take political ads down. That's why it is kind of controversial for what Twitter did. But I wrote a piece in the Washington Post recently where I talked about maybe we should consider hate speech laws in America. For a whole variety of reasons. But one reason is that the basis for the First Amendment protections is the marketplace of ideas. That's John Milton came up with it, great British thinkers, the framers talked about it. But the marketplace of ideas, the idea of the marketplace of ideas is that good ideas drive out bad ideas. Truth drives out falsehood. These guys, and they were all guys, were men of the Enlightenment. They believed in reason. Have you heard even the word reason lately? And it's like, and reason was a never explained thing. It came from God that people could make these decisions and be able to somehow suss out truth from falsehood. Never really explained how. No, there's no science behind it. So part of the reason I think we need to look at all of these things, both, you know, political speech, the First Amendment, advertising, is because the marketplace is now skewed. It's not a fair marketplace anymore. People are not able to tell the difference between truth and falsehood, between an ad that's fake and an ad that's real, or an ad that contains false information versus true information. I agree with you. I certainly don't want Facebook being the arbiter of what's true or false, but I also think our system as it exists now isn't working very well.
Well, just a little asterisk is I'm still going to keep myself on the place that says I'm still going to defend that reason space because I think it still has value. It may be under challenge because of the opening up of this whole marketplace to all kinds of people that most of us didn't know existed in the world. You know, I mean, who knew that people still, that there was beheadings, right? I mean, we thought that was out with with Henry VIII. You know, so we're being put in contact with a whole bunch of people with views and habits and practices that aren't necessarily convenient for us. But but I do think that you also need to continue to trust in the basic reason of a lot of people, and you still need to speak to that. You don't let this swirling controversy, you know how the whole thing about the disinformation is to make you believe that there's no truth? Let's not let this discussion convince us that there's no reason and that people need to be protected, that they can't think for themselves, because I think they actually can. I have a question for you, and you never should ask a question in public you don't know the answer to, but I don't actually know the answer to. How many of us in this room have been exposed to a deep fake?
A deep fake.
Does everybody know what a deep fake is? Why don't you explain a deep fake?
A deep fake is something, let's say, let's take a video of this panel right here, and let's edit in, you know.
I'll give an example.
Okay.
There was just one on UK television where one of the Remainers was asked a question, and it was edited to make it seem like he didn't have an answer to the question. And it showed him like sort of hemming and hawing and not answering. And it turned out that was completely edited. That wasn't the way he had responded at all. He had come back immediately with an answer. That probably wasn't a deep fake. That was probably a shallow fake, in that it wasn't very technologically complicated. A deep fake just means that they've used machine learning to make it seem really compelling and to make you look like you've said something you haven't.
And deep fakes, I think, has to, you know, the power of it is that the technology is going to get so sophisticated that you're going to be able to alter these pictures and images or create pictures and images in such a way that you won't be able to tell.
So here would be my question. Mm-hmm. By the way, I know this is facetious. How many people here have seen The Lion King? That's a deep fake. That was a joke. Because a deep fake is technology using artificial intelligence and machine learning to seem so real that you think you're watching a real video. So the danger of a deep fake is to have, I don't even want to be so inflammatory, having a political candidate say, I'm an agent of Moscow, or I'm trying to stage a coup in America. And you see it, it looks completely real. The technology is getting better every day. I mean, The Lion King is extraordinary, right? It looks like you're actually watching animals sing. And we know that's not true. So the question is there an example of a deep fake that should be protected by the First Amendment? What is a good, positive example of the use of a deep fake?
The Lion King. did I get that right? Thank you. Thank you. Did I get that one right?
Yes, that's a good answer. I threw it out there like the lion took it right there. And so, but in the political context, I don't know, I can't for the life of me think of what is a positive deep fake that should be protected, right? I don't know. Anyone have an idea?
Nancy Pelosi was thrown in on one of those when she was shown as
Right.
So that was they call that a cheap fake because all it was slowing down her speech to make it seem like it was slurred. But I would argue there, so that was protected by Facebook because it was political speech and it was part of an ad. Again, I can't think of a positive or redeeming aspect to that. And part of the reason that Facebook doesn't take it down goes back to what I was talking about how they're regulated. If they take it down, you know what that makes them? Editors. And the Communications and Decency Act treat all of the platform companies not as editors, but as the phone company, basically. So they're not liable for the content that they're publishing. That needs to change. And I think there's a bipartisan reason to do that. But one reason they don't take it down is that then congressmen will go, well, you're an editor, and I'm going to regulate you like the Philadelphia Inquirer or Time Magazine. Well, I don't recommend that they get regulated like those two publications, but I do recommend that they have some liability for content that they publish. False content, defamatory content, deep fakes, hate speech. So that would actually clean up a lot of the pollution in this ecosystem.
It's really interesting. So just in the last couple of weeks since Mark Zuckerberg's speech, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, under law, a bunch of Facebook employees, like a whole bunch of people have spoken up and to say very similar things to what you're both saying, which is, you know, we have to worry about civil rights and human rights online. There's not a marketplace of ideas. You know, let's come back and revisit this. So I want to open it up to the audience, but I want to ask you all a pessimistic question, but then maybe you can make it less scary for us. Like because you both have worked all over the world and you've seen how a situation can degenerate. And you talked about beheadings. I mean, where could this all go? You know, could this disinformation actually lead to violence in America? Tell us about what's happened in the rest of the world as a result of disinformation. And if you could do one thing, you know, or any of us in the room could do one thing, you know, AOC said, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did a little video the other day where she said, don't let your parents watch Facebook. Watch Facebook unsupervised. You know, that was her one thing. So maybe if you have one thing that you would suggest folks do. But first, take us to the dark place.
Well, I'm going to start with the light place. I mean, one of the things I've said for a long time now is that we don't have a fake news problem, we have a media literacy problem. People have trouble figuring out the difference between fact and fiction. What AOC was saying, the fastest growing cohort on Facebook is much older people, even older than I am. And in fact, that is also, according to the Pew Research, the most divided, polarized group in America. One of the things that I propose is that the platform companies spend billions of dollars to have programs for school kids about media literacy, how to tell the difference between, I mean, one of the things I think that journalists get wrong is that crap that's along the bottom of the websites, that linked stories or taboola or whatever. Pew did a study that showed that 80% of middle schoolers couldn't tell the difference between a regular, story in the LA Times and this, things at the bottom that says, like, look at the celebrities you knew as a child and how they look now. Right? That, it helps pay for it, but I think it pollutes the ecosystem. So teaching people how to tell the difference between real news and fake news, between stuff that's verified and fact-checked, and there are organizations now that do that, that to me is the long-term solution. It's not a solution for 2020, but that is something that I think we can agree about that.
I can totally agree on that, and I'll do the same thing, the dark place and the light place. I mean, the light place is, just like any other big eras of social upheaval, we're thrashing out our standards and conventions right now. This is a period of great intellectual richness that you think about the Industrial Revolution, which brought us so much good and caused so much damage at the same time, and we had to thrash out our social norms during that time. That's happening right now, right in real time. We get to be part of it. Could it cause violence in the United States? I think it could cause violence in lots of places. And I was just reading recently an article about the escalation of hate speech in Hong Kong and dehumanizing speech on both sides, with the protesters dehumanizing the police dehumanizing the protesters. And they made the point that that is often a prelude to violence. And if you remember, you were talking about this. What's the first thing that people do when they're trying to take over something? They seize the means of communication. And you remember, those of you who are old enough, remembering the genocide in Rwanda, where people took to the radio waves and said, "Go kill Hutu, go kill Tutsi," and people took to it. And so you'd have one person who runs up to Comet Pizza and says, "I'm gonna, take care of this problem." The dehumanizing speech that we have all become accustomed to in social media, I think poses a huge problem. I have no idea how to handle it. I just happen to just keep telling myself, the social media is not the real world. It's just not the real world, and people say things to each other and about each other in that space that they would never say to each other in public, and that kind of even detached speech has consequences. It can have really terrible consequences, and how we deal with that, I have no idea.
So why don't we open it up to a few questions? And I would ask that, I don't know what the rules are, but I would ask that you identify yourself. Yeah.
You make the rules.
Okay, I'll make the rules.
I'm Joyce Davis. I actually am a journalist. I'm an opinion page editor for Penn Live in Harrisburg, but I'm also a former associate director of broadcasting for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which brings me to the question that I want to ask. The economic model is broken in the United States for the media. That's part of our problem. In order for local media to have the money, they have to generate those hits online. Have we thought about using a model, perhaps building on NPR, where I also worked, building on that model for BBC, where you can actually trust that it's independent media, not fueled by some economy? And then I wonder if you might also, Amanda, explain to them, though, that there is, while you offer Voice of America, there also still is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where journalists are putting their lives on the line every day. It's truly an effort that costs people's families and everyone a lot.
And maybe one thing that you could address in this, so when people suggest public funding for media, there's this fear that that means government control of media. Can you explain how that's not true in the case of RFE and VOA?
So Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, there's 5 of us all together. They're all together. We are all 100% financed. I like to say by you, we're taxpayer funded via the American Congress, and we are all legally protected from any kind of content manipulation or pressure from the outside. It's very specifically mandated. And yes, we have journalists who are putting their lives on the line, all of us in all of our areas. I just finished watching a video from our stringer in the Kurdish area of Syria, who, by the virtue of being our stringer, is now in grave danger of his life, and he's still there with his microphone going on TV every day. I just, there's a kind of bravery. Yeah. I bravery that I don't know that I possess. And I think you all might want to think about something, but backstage, we were just talking about one of the emerging models of media business models is a tripartite model, and there's actually lots of organizations who are pushing towards this, which is a tripartite thing, which is a third advertising, a third some form of subscription model, and a third philanthropy. And people have calculated the amount of money that would be needed to support local journalism in the United States, and they say it's about equivalent to what people spend on ballet. So if you start beginning to think about news as a public trust and something you contribute to the same way you contribute to the art museum or ballet or some other thing, people are starting to think about how you redo that. I find that a very promising way of thinking.
I'm Barbara Chatterjee from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we have where I'm a member of the Council on International Relations, which will next week have their second Journalism Under Fire conference, which is a really important discussion of some points that you just made, Amanda. My commentary is in two areas. One is the impact of the 24/7 news cycle and how it simply, in my word, regurgitates the same stuff over and over again. It can be the comments of the president, it can be smart stuff, not so smart stuff, but it really does what Richard said, it makes it sink into our brains like it's real. And the second commentary I have has to do with things like, say, broadcast of political debates, etc., where afterwards we are treated to extensive commentary and re-wisdom by the people who are in the news media and elsewhere. I'd like to have my own opinions trusted to make my own decisions. I don't need that commentary to tell me how to think. Thank you.
Don't take it personally, Richard.
I'm actually speaking at that Santa Fe conference next week, your conference. Yes. So to your last point, you can turn it off. You don't have to listen to the commentary.
It's a behavior.
Yes. I turn it off unless I'm doing the commentary. But about the 24/7 news cycle, I want to come back to something Amanda was talking about technological change. Because every generation has had technological change. When I became editor of Time, I did research into why Henry Luce started Time in 1923. Well, part of his explanation was there are 26 daily newspapers in New York City, and people are bombarded with information. They can't process it all. They need one place where they can see it. I mean, every era thinks they can't cope with the information in their new era. I mean, Plato said, writing was a bad thing because it would ruin memorization. So it started a long time ago. So I don't know that look, I feel overwhelmed by it too, but I do think human adaptiveness is such that we can adapt to it. Like my sons don't watch a movie before like 1970 because it's like too slow. So I do think the rapidity is not necessarily the problem, but the disinformation and all of that stuff, and the commentary. Okay.
So we're talking about disinformation and the role it has on our decisions. And so for me, the platform that facilitates it and allows it to happen to a greater degree is Facebook. So you mentioned several times Russian hacking in the last presidential elections, and I think everybody focused on Russia, while I think we're not focusing on the platform that allowed it to happen, that facilitated it, because it was Russia, it can be China, it can be Iran. So I think this is what my question is, why we're not looking at platform that allows it to happen, that represents, a great American company, a beacon of entrepreneurship, innovation, and great ideas. And my last question would be, when Facebook, instead of just connecting people, which is actually in reality disconnecting people, became the source of information, this is where I'm really worried. Because then Facebook tells me what to read. I don't need Facebook to tell me what to read because it will make me like this, and that's why we see polarization that we see today. So those are my question is, how should we address social media today, and what do we think about Facebook being, for so many people, the main source of information and news?
You didn't identify yourself.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Marieta Velikova from World Affairs, Tennessee.
And, I think those are all interesting questions. I always want to go back to people and say, well, what would you do? What would you like if you have the ability to do something about the problems you're describing? What would you do? Should we break up Facebook? Should we ban it? Should we force them to shut it down? Should we have government regulation of it? Should I regulate it? What would you like to have happen? It's a problem It's a thing that is happening out there as Rick said. It's just like the all kinds of other rapid technological changes. What would you do? What do you want to have happen right now? Are you thinking about that?
But I do have a specific recommendation, which is the changing of Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, so that these platform companies are considered publishers. Not publishers like a regular newspaper, but they have liability for content. So for example, one content that they would have liability for is demonstrably false content, that they can't publish it. Right now, they publish it and say, well, that's protected by the First Amendment. I also have news for everybody. The First Amendment doesn't apply to Facebook. The First Amendment applies to government. Congress shall make no law. Facebook can take anything off. They can take, they can take anything that's blue off of it and not violate the First Amendment because they're a private company. So if you change the regulation, if you make them more liable, they right now have complete blanket immunity for anything that they publish. Well, that's why there's so much trash, because they can publish trash. If they became legally liable for publishing trash in those categories, it would clean up the system, and not completely, but in a big way. And that's, yeah, so that's my hobby horse about this.
Wait, I think we're going to hear the other side of that story.
One problem of the vast majority of Facebook's operations are outside the United States. So that solves this much of the problem. How about the rest of the problem? This is a very US-centric solution. It's certainly not a solution for all of Europe or all of Africa, where Facebook is one of our main publishing platforms because its adoption is so widespread.
But those places have much stricter speech laws than the United States.
But I'm just saying you can't make one.
It's interesting right now in Europe. So we passed Section 230, enacted it, and then we sort of proselytized about it. And so Europe adopted something called the E-Commerce Directive, which also has intermediary liability rules, and they're actually re-looking at it now. They're getting ready to actually really wrestle with exactly this question. I mean, people on the Hill are thinking about it. I think what they're nervous about is that one of the things that's great about the internet is it's frictionless platform, so I can email anybody I want in the world. One of the things that's terrible about it is it's this frictionless platform. And so they're trying to figure out, would we create so many frivolous lawsuits that would bring the good stuff crashing down, and we wouldn't actually, because liability law in the US is so weak, that we wouldn't really, but I think one of the things that's really interesting, there was this privacy law that was passed in Europe that forced the US to look at privacy. It'd be interesting as they debate intermediary liability, will it force us to take a look at it?
Great.
Yeah. Why don't we go there? And identify yourself, please, so that Rick doesn't have to tell me how to moderate, which I really appreciate.
My name is Evan Odegaard. I'm a student from St. Paul, Minnesota. And you've been talking about social media's role in spreading false information digitally. In your opinion, is social media more of a threat or an opportunity for the future of good journalism?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that completely.
In your opinion, is
last
social
question.
media more of a threat or an opportunity to the future of good journalism?
That's a great question.
Well, what do you think?
So on the panel that we were on, I don't want you to be disappointed like we'd never met each other. But so someone asked the question at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, do you think, to both of us, do you think there's more wrong information, disinformation, relative to the total supply of information that exists now compared to other times in
That was
history?
actually me.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a brilliant question,
Why, thank you.
and we thought about it, and I've been thinking about it since then.
Good.
So, because I'm still an internet idealist. I just think, I remember a few years ago, I remember spending like months when I was a grad student at the British Museum Library, which is one of the greatest libraries in the world. And then, I don't know, like 10 years ago, every single person on the planet on their phone had access to every single book and line of print in the British Museum Library. I mean, that's a transformational thing in human history. I mean, so that once upon a time, information was scarce, right? Why did Benjamin Franklin start the first lending library in Philadelphia? Because nobody had any books. So information was scarce. So the question is, I think there's now way more information relative to anything else than in history. What's different, I think, is the availability of disinformation. One of these cognitive biases from the great Daniel Kahneman is the availability heuristic. Because you can pull something and have access to it, you think it's bigger than it actually is. But so now, once upon a time, to find a conspiracy theory, you'd have to like go to the library and look up this stuff. Now you can just like type in the conspiracy theory of your choice, and then you see it, and you think it's probably more widespread than it is. So I actually think that the amount of disinformation relative to information now may be no different than any time that it was in history. That doesn't answer your question, young man, does it?
Yeah. Well, no, I would jump in with that because I actually agree. I don't think that the ratio of disinformation to good information is any higher. It's that there's so much more of everything. And, you know, I'm just reading for bizarre reasons about the Reformation, and there's a big, battle going on right now with everybody fighting the translation of the Bible into English from Latin. So you translate the Bible into English and let people actually read those words and don't depend on an intermediary. That's a very dangerous concept. And that's essentially what's happened, is that Facebook and Twitter and all these things on a huge, huge scale have translated this all into English for us. And that's going to bring us vast benefits. But this is a period where we're going to have to fight out all of the unexpected negative consequences. Just as I say, during the Industrial Revolution, you had to cope with urban poverty and rural devastation. That was a terrible period of world history. This is too in some ways, but it's also something that's going to be going forward.
I still think the benefits vastly outweigh the drawbacks.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I think we're almost at time, so could we just maybe, who's an organizer? Do we have to cut it off? One last question.
Okay, I have a question for Amanda. My name is George Pope, World Affairs Council, Charleston, South Carolina. In my early days in the international world, the Voice of America was my lifeline.
Thank you.
When I was in Chile as a Peace Corps volunteer, if it hadn't been for the VOA, I probably would not have known JFK had been assassinated for a month when my parents' letter got there. Then later, Indonesia, Nigeria, the Willis Conover jazz show that some of you may remember. My question now is, you guys obviously have had to change with the times. Is there any way that I or anyone else here might be interested, be able to listen to an evening of your program, the news, the comments, the light entertainment?
So, we're legally prohibited from broadcasting directly into the United States, but
So
there
that
was,
hasn't changed,
but
okay.
there was a change that allows, because you can't block the internet, the incidental transmission into the United States. So I'm not allowed to tell you that we've got these fantastic apps that you can download on your phone, and I can't tell you about the web page that we have that runs all our content in various languages, or the Facebook application. So find out about, ask somebody else.
Okay.
So we've had this amazing conversation. You can see they obviously need to take this show all across the country. But because it cheers, I don't know about the rest of you, but it cheers me up to hear their war stories and to know that they're both still in the fight. would you guys wrap it up? You know, where are you each, you know, what else are you each hoping to do in the world of disinformation?
I'll wrap it up. Buy Rick's book.
Yeah, buy Rick's book.
That will solve the whole problem.
Yeah.